Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes the safety net away from America's poor families.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Brown, for unanimous consent request.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the children of America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, for unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts America's children.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his point.
Mr. Speaker, I have finally received a copy of the bill. It appears to have no nutrition title at all. Is this a printing error?
The gentleman has not stated a parliamentary inquiry. From Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in total opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts America's children.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker,
the chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate concurs in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 588, cited as the Vietnam Veterans Donor Acknowledgement Act of 2013.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases hunger in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because we are the conscience of the Congress. The majority of people getting food stamps are not African American.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes the safety net away from America's poor families.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield to the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes the safety net away from America's poor families.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for unanimous consent request.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for a unanimous consent request.
The
Mr.
gentlewoman
Speaker,
is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in very strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases poverty in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in total and strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it starves America's children.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wilson, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes food from children and it increases the number of starving children in America.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts. For what point?
Mr. Speaker, referring to your previous ruling, one is allowed to give explanation for their opposition, and those words are to be counted as part of the unanimous consent.
In the opinion of the chair, the woman exceeded those simple declarative statements. I'm trying to be fair with this.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you declare, Mr. Speaker, what the interpretation is for excessiveness?
The chair will judge each statement as to its simple declarative nature.
Continuing the parliamentary inquiry, is the amount of passion in your voice and opposition to the idea that this bill creates more starving children, is that what will create?
The gentlewoman has not stated a point. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time has the Speaker charged us for these unanimous consent requests thus far?
A minute and a quarter. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I am happy to yield to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill and the underlying bill because it contributes to hunger in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill and the underlying and the rule because it increases hunger in America. Mr. Speaker, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentlewoman will state her inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, is it in order to amend the underlying bill and the rule that currently provides for billions in subsidies to corporate farms while children and families go hungry, school lunch programs are decimated, and Meals on Wheels are taken from the disabled and senior citizens?
The manager of the rule would have to yield for any amendment. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes food and nutrition from working families. And Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry, please.
Gentleman will state his
Mr. Speaker, will not this day go down in history as one of the most shameful days in American history?
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill, to the rule, and to the underlying bill because it takes the safety net away from America's poor children.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Bishop, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor and violates the long-standing partnership between agricultural producers and our nation's nutrition programs.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman will state his inquiry.
Isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that this rule takes and bifurcates the bill that came out of the authorizing committee and separates it into two separate bills in a way that ultimately hurts the working poor of this country?
Interpret the underlying bill.
The chair will not interpret the underlying bill. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes the safety net away from America's poor families and takes food out of the mouth of children.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from South Carolina for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill, the rule, and the underlying bill because it significantly increases poverty in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I will yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
The House will come to order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases poverty in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hinojosa, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as chair of the CHC, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in very strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts America's poor children and senior citizens.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts. For what purposes,
Parliamentary inquiry. I've been listening, as I'm sure you've observed, to the judgments. Now, what the gentleman just did, Mr. Hinojosa, was one sentence, but it had an and he gave a second reason they was opposed. The first reason, because it increased poverty, and the second, undermined children. That was the same sentence. It seems there was little substantive difference between the statement that preceded it, for which you did not charge time, and for the statement from the gentleman from the Hispanic caucus. And I would like to understand the parliamentary difference that the Speaker perceived in those two statements.
In the opinion of the chair, the gentleman engaged in embellishment.
He stated two reasons he was opposed. Is the chair's ruling that only one reason will be allowed to be articulated by a member for opposition to this bill?
The gentleman also prefaced his remarks.
He did do that.
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
And explain to the American public, who presumably is watching this, Mr. Speaker, as to the framework from which he was speaking, representing a large group of Americans, Hispanic Americans, who have a large number of representatives in this body. Can he not explain that he is the person from Maryland, for instance, or the person from some other state?
In the opinion of the chair, the gentleman engaged in embellishment. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor, it leaves children without food, and it hurts seniors on an everyday basis.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, in parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
In explaining, in your answer to the last parliamentary inquiry, you indicated that the problem was that he embellished by introducing himself as chairman of the Hispanic caucus. The gentleman from New York who just spoke did not do so, but simply articulated 3 reasons he was opposed to this bill. It seems to me that that is certainly within the contemplation of a unanimous consent request. And if we start parsing that people can only articulate 1 reason, I would suggest to our friends, the parliamentarians, and to the Speaker, that that will establish a precedent which will be very difficult and subjective for implementation by the Speaker. And I ask the Speaker to perhaps further explain why Mr. Meeks's objection was charged to Mr. McGovern's time.
The chair is looking at a simple declarative statement, not multiple simple declarative statements. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
There was 1 declarative sentence. It had 2 commas in it. Now, if we're going to parse this to that extent, I suggest to the Speaker and frankly to those who are advising the Speaker that we are going down a road which is very dangerous. Clearly, if there was an extended time, one could understand that. But adding 2 very short parenthetical phrases is, I think, Mr. Speaker, inconsistent with your previous rulings as to when you would not charge the time against Mr. McGovern. Again, Mr. Speaker, I understood that when Mr. Hinojosa introduced himself as representing all of the Hispanic caucus when he objected to the underlying bill, that might be perceived as a greater explanation than the Speaker would think warranted. But Mr. Meeks's statement following that immediately was a simple declarative statement with 2 parenthetical phrases, not long in nature, explaining why he was objecting. It seems to me that's consistent with the rules and the procedures of the House.
The chair will continue to evaluate each individual declarative statements and make the judgment there with regards to embellishment according to the previous statements that have been made. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire how much time has been charged against us for these unanimous consent requests thus far?
2 minutes total.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry. Would it be in order for me to ask for unanimous consent that the time that has been charged against us be restored?
Yes. I object to that.
The objection is heard. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, Mr. Speaker, further parliamentary inquiry. I didn't make the request yet.
The gentleman can make this request.
I ask unanimous consent that the time charged against us be restored, given the fact that we are operating under a closed rule on a very important piece of legislation where a lot of members would like to be heard.
Is there objection to the gentleman's request?
There is objection.
Okay. There is objection. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Nolan, for a unanimous consent request.
Is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule in the underlying bill because it violates a decade-old principle uniting urban and rural interests together in feeding hungry people.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in very strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because veterans in my district, including children and patriotic families all across America, are hungry.
And the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis, for a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill and the Farm Rule and the underlying bill, because it increases hunger of our constituents throughout this great country of ours.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to yield to the I yield to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for a unanimous consent request.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to this ill, mean-spirited Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it takes food nutrition from those most vulnerable among us, our children. Is this what compassionate conservatism is all about?
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Mississippi. I yield to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases hunger not only in my congressional district, but hunger in all congressional districts in America.
Without objection, the gentleman is from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases hunger in America.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, is it the ruling of the chair that if in stating my request for unanimous consent I state a single reason, it is not charged to the time of the gentleman from Massachusetts? If I state several reasons in the same sentence because I cited multiple reasons for requesting unanimous consent, that it is charged? Assuming I do it dispassionately, quietly.
The chair is not going to respond to a hypothetical. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it increases hunger in America, hurts seniors, and hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it hurts the working poor.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
No, he's going to go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to request unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because, Mr. Speaker, there is a 5-decade symbiosis between urban America and the farm community. Now, I rarely come to this well for a lot of reasons, most of them are negative, because I didn't come to Congress to make an enemy. I came here to make a difference. I'm not here, Mr. Speaker, trying to put politics above productive policy, ideology above the injured. I'm not here to foment division, but inclusion. I'm not here because I believe in capitulation, but in compromise. I believe that this bill is doing enormous damage not only to the body politic, but to this nation. And we, the elected leaders of the United States Congress, this is not some little club. We are the Congress of the United States of America, the most powerful nation on this planet. And we can take care of all of the people. There are poor children in rural areas that I represent, and I will never turn my back on them. I will never turn my back on children in the urban core. Mr. Speaker, I object to this bill because this bill is not just going to create tension among us, but the people of this country who depend on us. They depend on us. It's not like they can go to an alternative body to redress their concerns. If we are about anything, it is about trying to take care of these people. That's why we're here. I suffer from vertigo. And the only way I can stop from wiggling around and fainting when I get dizzy with vertigo is to keep my eyes on something that doesn't move. I get frustrated and dizzy being in this body. And the only way I can stand up is keep my eyes on something that doesn't move. And the thing that does not move are the people of the United States, particularly those who are hurting. They don't move. My mind is going to stay right there on people who don't move, the hurt, the wounded, even the wealthy. They are Americans. We've got to make sure we take care of everybody in this country, Mr. Speaker. I will not, I shall not, I cannot be silent as we continue to divide the nation. And then we think we're doing something good because we're able to say something nasty to somebody. The people of this country deserve better. We deserve better. I've never attacked people on the basis of their party or their ideology, and I won't do it. I will not do it. But I will not abandon what's right. I will not abandon the things that I keep my eyes on. I will not support this bill. There are people in rural counties that I represent where Saline County, Missouri, a rural county, has greater poverty than Jackson County, where Kansas City sits. So this is not about trying to destroy some kind of system that we put in place to protect the rural areas. I'm concerned about the rural areas. I was born in Waxahachie, Texas. My daddy sent my mother to college when I was in the 8th grade. I'd never lived in a house with indoor plumbing until I was almost 8 years old. I lived in public housing. My daddy struggled with a little help, My daddy sent 4 children through college. We moved out of public housing. My daddy lives in his own house right now in Wichita Falls, Texas. All people are asking for, in some cases, just a little help. Just a little help. And who can they turn to? I hope, I actually even pray, that it's the United States Congress.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Are we done with
the gentleman will state his inquiry. The gentleman is correct. 4.5 minutes. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, just so parliamentary inquiry, just so I'm
gentleman will state his inquiry.
I'm clear. So 4.5 minutes total for all the unanimous consent requests?
7.25.
So 7.25 minutes have been charged to us for unanimous consent requests, notwithstanding the fact that we have a closed rule. And I think everybody stayed within the limit, maybe with a little bit of an exception. I would ask unanimous consent that that our time be reinstated.
The gentleman has requested. Is there objection?
There's objection.
There is objection. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
like to, Speaker,
The gentleman is recognized.
I move that I'd like to appeal the ruling of the chair. I move that the
There is no ruling before the House at this time.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. Parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would it be in order to move a motion that the time not be charged to Mr. McGovern as the representative of the ranking member of the Rules Committee, that move a motion be in order that we could vote on? Would that be in order, Mr. Speaker?
There is not an appropriate motion on that topic.
Mr. Speaker?
Who seeks time?
Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman from Maryland.
Further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
I'm reluctant to move something that the Speaker has been advised is not available to us. On the other hand, this is an issue, and under my parliamentary inquiry, I would ask my friend, the chairman of the Rules Committee, if he might reconsider his objection. There are very strong feelings on this bill. This bill was not noted for consideration until last night. This bill comes to the floor with less than 12 hours preparation, and while I understand the gentleman's view, but it would seem not so much because it's the rule, but because it is fair. There are strong, deeply held feelings on this bill, and I would urge my friend to withdraw his objection. We're talking about probably 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know how much time Mr. Cleaver took, minutes, so that we could have the full 30 minutes of debate on the rule itself. I would ask my friend if he would consider that.
Yeah, in fact, Mr. Speaker, I object, and I will, when I receive the time, offer an explanation.
Who seeks time?
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And to the gentleman, the minority whip, I would encourage him to please recognize that his request to me, as my dear friend, the gentleman, Mr. McGovern, as we stated last night in the Rules Committee, I would encourage you to please offer me an opportunity to explain not just the position, but what I believe is the intent of what we're attempting to do. Mr. Speaker, in the vote that was held for the Farm Bill, 171 Republicans voted for it, 62 Republicans voted against it. For the Farm Bill, 24 Democrats voted for it, 172 Democrats voted against it. This meant that the Farm Bill did not pass. It did not pass this body, and as a result of the significance of the underlying legislation of the Farm Bill that does include provisions related to SNAP, the Republican leadership, up to and including the Speaker of the House, the gentleman from Ohio, and the Majority Leader, the gentleman from Virginia, felt it was very important for this body to, as quickly as we returned, to offer a bill that could be passed with the hope that could be passed. An analysis of that bill was done. Once again, remembering that only 24 Democrats helped to pass the previous bill. We're attempting to then separate, bifurcate, offer today a rule and the underlying legislation which hopefully will pass, which would go to conference, and the Senate, because they have passed their own Farm Bill, has included in provisions where they discuss SNAP. As a result of that, that will be included in their bill. on a conference measure. The House simply at this point, if we pass this part, could go to conference, and would be without resolution, would not have passed an amendment or a piece which would discuss it. So in essence, my conferees, your conferees, our conferees, that would include the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Peterson, as well as Mr. Lucas from Oklahoma, would go to the conference without resolution from this body. That's all we're talking about. It's fully debatable under the conference. We simply would not have made a decision to change existing law. And the change in existing law would mean that the Senate conferees could stick to their position and hold to cut $4 billion, and we would not have a position to cut a penny. I believe that this is an honest attempt to get us to go to by passing part of the Farm Bill to get to conference. And the tactics against that are simply to keep us from going to conference, and where we would show up with whatever we pass. Now, if I have overstated this or understated this, I would encourage the minority whip to please engage me in a colloquy at this time, and I would yield to the gentleman on the substance of what I have spoken about, to feel free to enlighten me and for us to work through this very important issue. And I would yield to the gentleman.
I thank my friend for yielding. First, let me say that this side of the aisle believes the passage of the Farm Bill is very, very important. It's important for our agricultural interests, for our farmers. We believe it's very important for those who are relying on nutritional programs and support from us. So we share the view and are strongly in favor of the view of passing a Farm Bill. Number one, I tell my friend. Secondly, I would tell the gentleman, as he well knows, the Farm Bill for the past 2 years has passed out of the committee with a majority of Democrats and I think maybe unanimous, but certainly the overwhelming majority of Republicans. It passed out last year as a bipartisan bill. It was not brought to the floor. It was not brought to the floor, as the gentleman recalls, because of the controversies on your side, not our side of the aisle. Mr. Peterson, to whom the gentleman referred, the chairman of the committee, was in support of the Farm Bill. In fact, had indicated that he thought that there would be sufficient Democrats with Republicans to pass the Farm Bill. Very frankly, as the gentleman articulated, you lost 62 votes on your side of the aisle, notwithstanding the fact that you adopted 3 amendments during the course of consideration of the Farm Bill that Mr. Peterson advised you would undercut his ability and the Democrats' ability to support the bill. Very frankly, I tell my friend that what has happened, the Farm Bill was a bipartisan bill supported by a majority of Democrats in the committee, as the gentleman knows, and by the ranking Democrat, Mr. Peterson. It came to the floor, however, and that partisanship was undermined by the amendments that were adopted. And I think that was to the knowledge of certainly of Mr. Lucas. I know Mr. Lucas knew that that was undermining it. We now find ourselves in a position, and I understand what the gentleman has said trying to get to conference, where there was little or no discussion, certainly not with me, not with Leader Pelosi, about how we could move forward in creating a greater bipartisan coalition, with clearly recognizing there was opposition in your party and opposition in our party. So that the way that this could have passed in a constructive way, in my view, would have been had we reached a bipartisan compromise. Unfortunately, as is too frequently the case, we have seen where we have gone to, in my perspective, an ultra-partisan resolution to try to pass this bill and presumably pick up a number of the 62. You'll need a substantial number of the 62, because I think we don't believe, as you can tell, that this is a process that we can support. But it is unfortunate, because the gentleman is correct, and I respect the gentleman's observation. It's important that we pass a farm bill. But for over half a century, we have passed a farm bill in a bipartisan fashion with consideration for the nutrition people in our country, to make sure that those were without food and were hungry
Reclaiming my time.
would have food. If I could,
Reclaiming my time.
Can I take 30 seconds?
Gentleman reclaims.
Reclaiming my time, and I would encourage the gentleman to still stand. We are now here at a point on the floor where we are rightly or wrongly attempting to be forthright and honest about what is in the bill and what our intents are. And I would hope that the gentleman would recognize that what we have carefully done is excluded some extraneous pieces which might mean, if the gentleman excluded the things that would cause the bill to fail and would not allow us, because we come to no decision therein of the House, that we could not pass the final bill. And what we're trying to do is take this to conference without any decision thereon. And that is not an indication of a lack of willingness on the part of the Republican leadership or any of our Republican members. It simply says we could not come to a decision at this point, and what we're trying to do is to move forward so we can get the conference. And the gentleman, I hope, does recognize that the Senate has spoken, our conferees would be at the table, and simply would not have a position that has been taken by this House. In no way would it mean it couldn't be discussed or could not be done. So I would encourage the gentleman to understand then current law would prevail. Then current law would prevail because we've come to no decision therein. I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves.
The gentleman will allow me to respond to what he just said.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I urge every single Democrat and Republican to oppose this rule and to oppose this bill. This is a closed rule. Closed. No amendments. Closed. And contrary to the claims by some, this bill is not identical to the bill we voted on a few weeks ago. The Republican majority has in fact dramatically changed this farm bill. This 608-page bill, introduced an hour before the Rules Committee met last night, has several major changes that we know about. I say know about because we really don't know what's in this bill, and we do not know how some of the changes will affect long-term farm policy. Something new in this bill is the repeal of the 1949 permanent law. What does that mean? What impact will that language have on future farm policy? Who knows? There hasn't been a single hearing on this language, nor has there been a markup. Nothing. Nothing. This bill also eliminates the entire nutrition title, which includes more than just food stamps. It includes monies for food banks, emergency food assistance, and food for our senior citizens. The whole title is gone. 3 weeks ago, the Farm Bill was defeated because Democrats were strongly opposed to the assault on nutrition programs, and quite frankly, some right-wing Republicans voted no because they oppose nearly all government programs. Rather than trying to moderate the bill by working with Democrats, rather than compromising, Republican leaders have veered sharply to the right, trying to win back the Republican Tea Partiers who voted no. And the result of all of this is the bill before us. Now, my question is, what were the right-wingers in the Republican conference promised in order to change their votes from no to yes? What is the backroom deal that they have negotiated with the Republican leadership? How deep of a cut in the SNAP program were they promised? Now, last night at the Rules Committee, we were told there's nothing to worry about, that even though Title IV is not included in this legislation, it is still conferenceable if the bill were to go to conference with the Senate. We were told that rather than the $20.5 billion cut to SNAP that was in the House bill, that it was possible we could end up with a Senate-passed $4.5 billion cut, or that we could end up with no cuts at all. Does anybody believe that either of those two scenarios is likely or even possible? In this Congress, now I have great respect for the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Lucas, but I do not trust this Republican leadership. I spent a great deal of time on this House floor during the debate on this bill a few weeks ago, and I heard Republican speaker after Republican speaker attack SNAP, attack poor people, and diminish their struggle. We had nasty amendment after nasty amendment attached to the bill, attacking the nutrition programs that benefit the most vulnerable in America. Some of the rhetoric that was spoken on this floor, quite frankly, was offensive. And leading up to today's vote, I read with great interest the recent quotes from Republican members, some who call for sunsetting of the food stamp program, and some who call for deeper cuts in the program. And I just want to say, for the record, to my friend from Texas, the 47 million people who are on SNAP are not extraneous. They are important. They are part of our community, and we should not diminish their struggle. So let's be clear. This attempt to separate the nutrition title from the rest of the Farm Bill is all about gutting the nutrition title. It's all about going after Americans who are struggling in poverty. It's all about denying the working poor the right to food. So when we're asked to trust Republican leaders, to give them the benefit of the doubt, I can't. Trust is something that is earned, and the behavior of this Republican House towards programs that help the working poor, the needy, and the vulnerable has been appalling. Mr. Speaker, this is a bad bill. This is a bad process. It should be defeated. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I've represented my party and my leadership on the floor today in the most sincere way, with an opportunity for me to discuss with senior members, not just of the Rules Committee, but also of the Democratic leadership. And in no way is the Republican Party trying to do anything more in this bill that's on here today other than to bifurcate and to pass pieces of legislation that then can go to conference. But we have to find a way to pass the bill. I would remind my colleagues that 172 Democrats voted against the bill, then passing it to go to conference, and 171 Republicans voted for the bill and sending it to conference. The height of really the work that we do is to gain a chance to have a product, in this case the Farm Bill, that can then go to conference. It's not hyperbole. It is an actual event that can happen because the Senate has done their work and finished their work. We are trying to do the same. I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in strong opposition to the Farm Bill rule and the underlying bill because it's sinful, it increases poverty in America, and it takes the food off of the table of American families.
Without objection, the gentleman's time will be charged. Gentleman from Massachusetts. Does the gentleman make a point of order?
I make a point of order.
And what is the gentleman will state his...
The point of order is that, in fact, consistent with your rulings today, that the gentleman unanimous consent request was not any different in substance or in length than the unanimous consent requests that have been made on a number of occasions, and time was not charged. That is inconsistent. It is a subjective judgment, and I appeal the ruling of the chair.
Does any other member wish to be heard on the point of order? If not, the chair is prepared to rule. The decision on how and when a member will be charged in a debate in a matter confined to the discretion of the chair The question on whether the form of a unanimous consent request is in order under the rules is a matter subject to the ruling from the chair. In the opinion of the chair, it is not in order to embellish a unanimous consent request with debate remarks in the form of a debate, and the form of the debate are charged to the member yielding.
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
The request by the gentleman from Louisiana contained remarks in the nature of a debate. The point of order is overruled.
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
The question is, shall the decision of the chair stand in the judgment of the House? Does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to lay the appeal on the table.
The question is on the motion to table. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favor a recording vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
So the House today has been debating procedure related to debating the rule for considering the revised Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, as such, sets agriculture and food nutrition programs, which includes food stamps. This new bill leaves out food stamps, and it continues agriculture programs for another 5 years. The White House has threatened to veto the new revised Farm Bill. The Senate has already passed their version of a Farm Bill. This is a 15-minute vote, and while this vote is underway, we will show you now live coverage of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on transitions in Afghanistan.
Misused and to strengthen the government. I think we have to recognize, first of all, that Afghanistan is in Central Asia. And so when we talk about levels of corruption, we need to look at Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. We need to note that Afghanistan has a more efficient tax collection system than Pakistan. Only marginally so, but and puts it in a little bit of perspective.
Sure, some of your comparisons aren't exactly the best countries that we like to
look at
as model examples of good governance.
No, exactly, they're the worst. But that's the neighborhood that Afghanistan is in. And Afghanistan was, first of all, the poorest of all those countries to start with.
But the United States
and it had no government at all.
Engaged in this country now for 11 years.
I take that.
You know, we should be able to have some impact on what legacy we leave to the people of Afghanistan.
And I agree entirely with you. And this is a problem on which we need to continue to work in terms of our own efforts. About 10% of our total civilian strength in Afghanistan is dedicated to oversight and accountability of our own programs. In terms of the effectiveness of our aid programs, in my opening statement, I think, I mentioned that if you look at outcomes, if you look at the levels of literacy, levels of longevity, the projection of health care, education, the Afghan government is actually providing services which have historically never been provided before in Afghanistan to the population, certainly not at current levels. So despite the corruption, despite having had no government at all 10 years ago when I last held this position, or 12 years ago rather, when I last held this position, you have a government that's performing by regional standards not very badly, and by standards compared to other conflict and post-conflict societies, among the best in terms of actually delivering services and producing outcomes that improve the lives of the population. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not absolutely right to keep harping on corruption and keep insisting that we do more about it.
For the Afghan people to have a reasonable chance for a stable government, Senator Corker is right. They have to have a secure country. So the military issues are very, very important. Governance is extremely important, and the corruption issue, I would point out, I think we have not taken aggressive enough steps during these years to give a better opportunity for good governance. The third is economic opportunity. And with the removal of the international presence, military presence, that's going to have a major impact on the economy of Afghanistan. What steps are being taken in order to provide economic opportunity for the people of Afghanistan as we transition to the elimination of American combat troops?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the reductions in the NATO military presence there is going to have some impact on the economy. I think the latest World Bank assessment was that it would lead to not a negative growth, but a very significant drop in positive growth. It's important that the non-military assistance flows continue beyond the departure date for most U.S. troops. And I think that's one answer to your question. There's no doubt that the Afghan economy has undergone a considerable growth over the last decade. Indeed, I think the increase in GDP at a per capita basis is about 130% over that period, which is pretty substantial. Afghanistan has been growing at a rate comparable to China for most of the period we've been there, and that's probably not going to continue. You're going to see some diminution in that growth, and it'll be important for our assistance and other forms of international assistance to continue to flow in the post-2014 period.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with Senator Corker in regards to the need for the military security of Afghanistan. I think I may come at it from a different position as to the need for American troops to be there. But I think I think every member of this committee wants to see more clarity on how the decisions are being made on troop levels as we go into this critical year. So I would just urge the continued openness to this committee as those decisions are being made. Americans expect Afghanistan to take responsibility for its own country, and I think we need to know what continued commitments are being made on behalf of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to associate myself with the remarks of both Senator Corker and Senator Cardin regarding the clarity issue on those decisions. I think it's critical not only for Congress but for the American people to have a much better understanding, higher level of understanding than we do. Having said that, those of us on this side have an important meeting at 11 o'clock this morning, and it was just called yesterday, which is unfortunate because this is a critically important issue, and we'll obviously be watching the transcript of this as we go forward. I was hoping to hear at least part of panel 2, but that's not going to be possible. But in any event, I'm going to yield back my time again with the thanks for holding this hearing, and we'll review the transcript after we're done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome you, Mr. Ambassador, and Doctor, thank you for your public service. I wanted to start by way of reiteration, hearkening back to what the chairman said about the elections and what happened in our committee as it relates to the resolution which has now been passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, that you reconsider the position the administration took with regard to dedicating an ambassadorial level person to monitor the elections and to make a much greater commitment, because I believe that if we don't have that kind of oversight or involvement as it relates to the Afghan elections, our strategy will be adversely impacted. So I'll just make that point, and we can develop it further later. I wanted to start, though, with a question as it relates to women and girls in Afghanistan. We have had over the last decade or so, tremendous progress, the number of girls going to school, literally millions now that weren't going to school before. A lot more participation by women in the political process, even more involvement of women in the Afghan security forces. Unfortunately, though, we have at the same time great concern. We know that just recently in Helmand, Lieutenant Islam Bibi was assassinated. And she joined the police force 9 years ago when it was particularly risky to do so. That's a grave understatement. So we've had progress in some areas, but setbacks. And an overarching concern is that when we draw down completely, when our forces are out, when the focus is not, our focus is elsewhere, that Afghanistan will go back to the old ways, where women are not just marginalized, but really targeted for discrimination and abuse, and no effort or little effort will be undertaken to either maintain the gains or to advance in the direction of more political participation and more involvement of women in the Afghan National Security Forces. So because of that concern, I had introduced and got passed an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act, which requires both of your departments, State and Defense, to report on efforts to improve both the recruitment of women as well as the retention of women in the Afghan security forces. In addition to that, the report has to speak to efforts made to train male security personnel on gender sensitivity. So I'd ask you a two-part question. It's really for both of you. Number one is, how do you assess progress on both of those measures, number one? And number two, when will the report be submitted?
Well, let me just say a general word and then turn to Peter on the more specific. We share your priority on the role of women. We agree that there's been remarkable progress, particularly when you're changing the social mores of an entire society. The role of women and women's equality is a problem in societies that are far more developed than Afghanistan. And so I think that we can take some satisfaction in the degree that it's been made. There is danger of rollback, and it's one of the reasons why a continued American commitment, once we withdraw from combat operations, is going to continue to be important. Let me turn to Peter on the more specific question.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, let me also speak to your general issue. The role of women in the armed forces is a priority for us, and what's very positive development to observe for the leadership of the military, for the leadership of the Army and the police, incorporating more women, giving them more responsibility, and treating them with the same dignity and respect as other soldiers and police is a priority for that leadership now. They're incorporating these norms and values in the leadership. So I do believe this will be sustainable going forward. And the statistics, I think, are impressive. I have here that the Afghan Army, there are now over 400 women in the Army. And that's very significant from zero. The Afghan police, there are over 1,500 women now serving in the police. And in Afghanistan's very small Air Force, there are 44 women now serving in this. So I think that the strides that have made to have these women in there, and I've met a number of these women in Afghanistan. They're some of the most patriotic, professional people in the entire country. And I think that experience is showing people that come from a different mindset, a different cultural background, that the role of women should be here to stay in Afghanistan. It's important for Afghans to recognize that. So, and I believe this is taking place. And I think it's, your support and others that have pushed us in this direction, the right direction, and it is working. Sir, you asked about this particular report. I can tell you right now that we are incorporating all the information that you've asked for in the broader 1230 report on Afghan National Security Forces, and I believe we have information coming up to you very quickly on when this will be handed over to you, but my understanding is that it will be coming up very, very soon. But we are attentive to it, sir.
Are we talking days or weeks?
It will be by the end of this month.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Because, like any society, we will measure the progress in Afghanistan, especially after we're disengaged, by one of several measures. This will be one of them: women's participation. It's extraordinary, as you know, and as people in the audience know that have had some interaction with women in Afghanistan directly. I had an opportunity back in 2011 to sit with women parliamentarians, people involved in the political process. One in particular, both her father and her husband were killed because of their political participation. Despite that horror, she still went forward and ran for office and stayed involved. So both on the political front and on the security front, it's vitally important. I'm running low on time, but I will submit a question for the record as well on the NRC Southwest, the $34 million building, which I know has been raised as a taxpayer issue and a taxpayer concern about waste. And I'll submit one for the record about the Pentagon's commitment on making sure that no more money is wasted on that kind of a structure. But I know we're out of time. But thank you very much.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your focus on this issue and for this hearing. Thank you to both of you for being here today. I recently returned from my fourth trip to Afghanistan, and I guess I came back with sort of three top-level takeaways. One, to agree in part with your assessment of our ability to stand up the Afghan military. They've clearly made significant gains. They certainly are able to fight on their own in many parts of the country. I'm not necessarily sure I'd share the same optimism or put them in the same boat as the status of the police forces, but the military certainly shows a lot of progress. On the negative side, two sort of connected takeaways. One was a pretty surprising amount of diversity of opinion on behalf of U.S. personnel there as to what is going to happen once we significantly draw down. And second, the opinion that comes from the Taliban that they are winning the fight there today, that they are very optimistic about their ability to take some significant control of portions of the country once we leave. And as I was there right at the beginning of the spring fighting season, there was a lot of talk about this being a very decisive moment in terms of that impression on the ground amongst the Taliban and many Afghan civilians that the Taliban is doing very well. And so I guess, Ambassador Dobbins, I'll just ask you this. What do we know so far about the spring fighting season? What do we know about the optimism of the Taliban? How has the military performed in what is, I mean, it seems like we say every single year this is going to be a critical fighting season, but this one certainly seems to be true. What do we know so far?
Well, I think Peter may want to, I'm sure will want to comment on this as well. The Afghan forces are definitely in the lead. They're taking by far the majority of casualties, and in our judgment, they're holding up well, but they're under significant pressure. Clearly, the insurgents are making every effort to knock them off balance and to undermine their self-confidence as they step out on their own. In terms of the Taliban, our impression is that there's something of a debate within the movement between those who see the military route as the only route forward and are confident of their ability to ultimately prevail, and those who have a broader recognition of the changes that have taken place in Afghan society, the unwillingness of the population to return to the conditions they were in a decade ago, and the recognition that if the Taliban were to win a military victory, the health clinics would close, the schools would close, the cell phone towers would close, the roads would get potholed, the TV stations would go off the air, they'd be getting no assistance, they'd be recognized by no country in the world, and they, even if they were successful militarily, they couldn't govern that country for any length of time. And that's the element that's arguing that they need to negotiate as well as fight. I don't know that there are any of them who just think they should negotiate, but there are those who think they should just fight and those who think they should do both. So that's the kind of division that we've seen so far. But Peter?
Yes, thank you, Senator Murphy. As you witnessed yourself, the Afghan security forces are doing a good job, and I think they're confident that they can achieve their mission. They are taking a lot of casualties. I think it's somewhere close to 400 killed in action every month total between Army and police. So the insurgents are going after them, but this poses a threat. It's a threat to their individual security, but operationally they perform very well, and they continue to hold and secure the major population centers in Afghanistan and the key routes of the communication throughout the entire country. So strategically, the mission seems to continue to be successful with the security forces in the lead. But you're right. There are a lot of questions about the future. And whether you talk to Americans or especially you talk to Afghanistans, there will be questions and uncertainties about what happens in the future. Afghanistan will be going through an unprecedented election where Hamid Karzai is not running. The outcome of this election is not clear to anyone. And we are doing, as Ambassador Dobbins indicated, everything we can to ensure a successful, fair, and free and representative election. But there is uncertainty. And in the security sector in particular, where you have good governance in the country, the security problem tends to be easily manageable by the Afghan army and police. Where you have poor governance, where you have district or provincial governors that are not addressing the grievances and needs of the population, the security problem is more pronounced, and it's more difficult for the Army and the police. So it gets to the point that I think the entire committee is making, and we hear very loudly, that improvements in the political transition need to go hand in hand with the ongoing improvements in the security transition.
Dr. LeVeaux, let me ask you a specific question about the capabilities that we will need to continue to lend to the Afghan military, and that is with respect to the air capabilities of the Afghan military. Very frustrating 10 years in to still see the status of the Afghan Air Force. We're contemplating sending to them a bunch of Russian helicopters, that there are legitimate questions as to whether they can even operate. As we take a look at what kind of support we're going to need to provide them in the long run, it seems hard to believe that we're going to be able to walk away from providing them with medevac support or with close air support, as the ground forces, which clearly have made progress, are out there doing the majority of the fighting. I walked away not completely understanding how we weren't going to have a long-term military commitment above the ground. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think you're right, Senator. With the terrain in Afghanistan and the difficulty to access remote regions, air mobility is a critical asset. The Afghans recognize this. The Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, they're looking to have their own air mobility, their own Air Force capability. And we are working with them to provide that capability. Now, we've gone from the security transition that's taking place. In the past, we would perform all of the air operations for the Afghans, and they would perform increasingly sophisticated ground operations. We're now moving in this transition phase where they're beginning to do more of the air operations themselves, and we're trying to work with them so that they will have this sustainable, self-sufficient air capability in the future. It's not clear to us, like it's not clear to you, sir, how long it will take for them to develop that capability. Training pilots is a laborious process, but it is something that we are prioritizing right now, and also getting them the equipment and helping them develop the means to maintain this equipment in a sustainable manner. As I indicated at the outset of my remarks, sir, we are conducting, the administration is conducting regular assessments of the performance of the Afghan security forces, including the Air Force. So we will make the necessary adjustments to ensure that they can have this capability going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. I was in Afghanistan last week with seven other senators and had robust discussions about the sort of midpoint in the fighting season, and there was some positive news, I think, in terms of our own military leadership's reckoning of the performance, even including the scale-up of some air capacity. More to tell. Much of the discussion that we had was about this troop number. We all recognize a troop number is not an end, it's a means to an end. And so, you know, what is the end we're trying to reach for? The ability to train, assist, advise in an appropriate way, the ability to provide some CT efficacy, and we talked about that. There has been public testimony before the SASC hearing where I sat from General Mattis in February recommending a troop level of about 13,600. General Dempsey in April publicly talked about a total force of between 8,000 and 12,000. I'm not going to ask you about numbers, but I will say what we heard from military leadership in Afghanistan was not at odds at all with that general range. I wanted to ask you a question, and I realized that one of the next witnesses, Stephen Hadley, actually phrased it better than I did. So I'm going to just read a section and try to get you to tell me whether or not you agree with it. And if I could just hand the witnesses Stephen's testimony, it's on page 2, and I just want to read this into the record. The unfortunate recent press accounts of a zero option, even if ultimately disavowed, are extremely damaging in this regard. The U.S. and its allies need to be actively countering the narrative abandonment that is frequently heard in Afghanistan. The best way to do this would be for the U.S. government to make clear as soon as possible its intention to have a robust troop presence in Afghanistan well beyond 2014 and to announce the size of that troop deployment even before negotiations have concluded on the bilateral security agreement that will provide the legal framework for this troop presence. The U.S. government should be clear that it's ready to negotiate an acceptable BSA with the current Afghan government or, if necessary, to leave that negotiation to the post-2014 government. But the U.S. troop commitment needs to be made clearly, and it needs to be made now. This will do 3 things. 1, it will reassure Afghans that their votes in the 2014 election will count for something because the government they elect will have the international support it will need to succeed. 2, it will encourage candidates to come forward to stand for election. And 3, it will lessen the ability of some Afghan elements to use the BSA negotiations as a political football in the service of other agendas. In your best independent professional judgment, do you think the prompt announcement of the size of that security force, leaving the size of it for military and the administration to determine, would have the positive effects that I referenced from Stephen Hadley's testimony?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First, as the best that I can determine, and I've spent some time trying to determine it, the leak to the New York Times about the zero option and what prompted the story was not intended. It wasn't a negotiating ploy.
The motion to table is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. House will come to order.